Psychologists of Reddit, what made you realize you were treating a psychopath? Clinical psychologist here. At first, I didn't know. If anything, given the context, he was more put together than most of my patients. The subject of his criminal past came up. I only knew he had served prison time some years before, not what he was in for. I had met with him a month or two when this came up. Turns out it was 2 separate sentences served. Both were for rape. In both cases, he was the exact thing we are afraid of. A guy lurking in a dark alley jumping a drunk girl. He told me about these things as if he was talking about the weather. When it dawned on me that he expressed no remorse or guilt whatsoever, I got the same cold. Gut-wrenching kind of primal fear you feel when you're out for a walk and almost step on snake. I am a mental health professional working in corrections max security facility. In my experience, psychopaths will have this predatory stare, especially when they are trying to manipulate you. It is completely unnerving and hard to describe to someone unfamiliar with this population. They also tend to be narcissistic and overly charming, making a point to be overly friendly with you. When telling that he kept thinking about how killing people would be more fun than lame animals, stray cats and dogs, and everything else he could catch. Only 11 years old. My mom worked with a boy 12 to 13 at the time who had killed animals. He'd raped a sheep, then cut its throat. He'd molested his younger brother. He was big for his age and wouldn't be allowed to be alone with female staff because he would always try to manipulate them and test his strength against them in subtle ways, i.e., he'd try to hug them but squeeze to see if they were strong enough to get out of it. They would often find drawings in his room of women tied up and mutilated. He wasn't allowed human-like toys anymore because he'd always destroy them, hang them, tie them up. The staff have all said it's only a matter of time before he actually kills a human, and at present, there's nothing they can do about it because when he hits 16, he'll no longer be in their care. They had a certain degree of sympathy for him due to his upbringing. His mother was a junkie and would often sell him and his brother to people. They'd pick the boys up in a car, take them away, abuse them, and then bring them back to her. When I was a student, we had an interview with a lady that killed her baby child with a handgun because it cried so much that she couldn't take it. At first, we weren't told that she was a psychopath, and we were just told to listen to her side of the story. She was reading us from her journal that she made while she was in the institution. Not once did she mention that she was sad that her baby died or how what she did was bad. She was just reading angry thoughts about her husband that left her and turned her in the police about what she did. She was justifying the killing because the baby was so unbearable. And once she mentioned that she was angry and mad that her husband did not believe her, that she didn't have any other choice but to kill the baby. She was very smart and well-spoken. And the whole time she was speaking, she was trying to make us feel sorry for her for being locked up. We later learned that sometimes she was lying about not killing her baby, and other times just brag about it, depending on who she was speaking with. Very normal-looking person and very good speaker. Edit, wow, was not expecting this much upvotes. So to answer some of your questions, I'm not from the US and I don't think her name will matter to any of you. She was not schizophrenic nor had postpartum psychosis. If she did, she would have felt any kind of remorse about what she did, which she did not. When I said normal person, I meant it in a way that if I was talking to her any other situation but this in a mental institution, I would have no idea that she is a psychopath. She killed her baby only for one simple reason. At the moment, it just wouldn't stop crying. She didn't try to hide it or anything. At first, she lied to her husband that it was by accident, but then she admitted, not a psych, but I was in the room where my mom was being evaluated. Well, I wasn't in the room. It was like a police interrogation room with a one-way glass. I was there because they needed to interview me for an outsider's perspective. Anyways, my mom got arrested on suspicion to commit a violent crime. To set the scene, she was handcuffed to a table and she was pissed. She's always had volatile anger issues due to heavy drug and alcohol use. She was being talked to, questioned, all this other stuff. I was there for about 3 hours. She kept running this lady in circles to divert her from the actual problem. She was insanely calm, answering questions about various things that would scare a normal person. She barely showed empathy for anything, and it was terrifying for me to watch. I knew she wasn't right in the head anyways. She was abusive to both my brother and I. But seeing how she handled the situation at hand, I'm glad I got out of there or it would have gotten much worse. I haven't talked to her in about 4 years, but she's tried to get in contact. I can't trust her and don't think I ever will again. You feel it in your gut first. Using a validated measure and constructing a thorough case history to discuss in supervision, this is how you test your gut feeling. But you feel it often quite quickly. It tends to begin with just a sense that something is off. When you're doing therapy with someone, we tend to build up quite a strong rapport with people. So there's lots of micromimicry going on, and you start to tune in quite deeply to unconscious body language. When you're in this state, sometimes you just start to feel very uneasy and you can't articulate verbally exactly why yet. This is often because of subtle microexpressions, super fast flashes of emotion, lasting fractions of a second that we perceive, but don't consciously register. You see flashes of contempt-related emotions and burglar smiles, basically emotions related to dominance and deception. The next thing you'll notice is a lot of use of projection going on. This starts quite quickly, usually in an assessment session, as an aside. Being assessed by someone else can feel quite threatening to anyone's self-image, let alone a psychopath's. Quite predictably, there will be status challenges, asking you about your credentials, your experience, etc., and then often some put-downs and digs with plausible deniability, e.g., joking that all psychologists are mad themselves, or just turning the tables by asking who's the maddest person you've ever treated. You start to feel on the back foot, and like you're now being assessed by them. As time continues, they will attribute a lot of their own emotions to you as the projection deepens. E.g., commenting that you look sad, asking if you're okay, or conversely asking why you got angry just then. As time passes, their effect turns from micro-expressions to more overt dominance displays, leaning back, smirking, getting up and striding around, etc. By this point, your initial gut feeling is getting more supportive evidence, and it's time to bust out the validated measures. The biggest sign of all is a general unwillingness to show any vulnerability at all or to be in a one-down position. The engagement will be superficial, often pally or matey, with lots of banter and joking, always flying close to the wind of outright mockery and contempt. They will start subtly and increasingly become overt in their need to control and dominate the therapy sessions. If the therapist maintains an aloof control, the ante may keep being raised and even end up with overt intimidation of the therapist. Not a psychologist, but a nurse who sees way too many psych cases. One time I had a PT who was brought in after trying to break into a family's house while they were home. He was on my telemetry unit because his electrolytes were out of whack, and he was acting like he didn't remember trying to bust into an entire family's house with them home. He was getting antsy, but the hospital I worked at had a stupid fall risk policy that kept patients in bed, even if they were young, healthy, capable of being responsible for their fall. Mental health patients like to pace, especially when they start to feel like they're using it. So, anyway, I'm trying to keep dude in bed because if his feet touched the floor, a loud alarm would go off, pushing his crazy ass closer to the edge. So, I'm in there trying to talk to him and de-escalate. We're talking, and he tells me he is a bad person, that his cat was mutilated, and his sister asked what happened to it, and he told her the dog did it. But he told me that his secret is that he did it. He killed the cat so bad that it looked like a dog ripped it to pieces. He also shared with me that he knew what he was doing when he tried breaking into the family's home, and that he wants to hurt people. Of course, I shared this info with the hospitalist and the psychologist, and naturally, he was discharged free and clear the next day. No follow-up with the law or outpatient psych. Gotta love it. Not a psychologist, but from my experience of dating a psychopath, didn't know until years in. A lot of what appears as emotion is simply mirroring emotions they see others exhibit and how they believe is the socially appropriate way to respond, whether or not they actually feel that way. This is how they blend in and appear normal to the average person. They are narcissistic, and everything revolves around them. They are always able to place blame on other people. Nothing is ever their fault. However, anything positive in their lives or others' lives is because of them. Because they are narcissists, they believe they are much more important than they actually are. They have strong influence over others because of their ability to feel nothing when manipulating others. And this is how they exert control over others. They will do whatever it takes in order to come out on top of a situation with no actual regard for others' lives or feelings. They may fake their feelings or reactions to continue to manipulate those around them, and they get pleasure over having control over other people and feeling like they're pulling all the strings. I used to work for a lady and her husband, who I'd bet money is a psychopath. His little daughter had a nasty accident that required brain surgery and facial reconstruction. He filmed the whole ordeal starting from moments after her fall up to bringing her home and uploaded it to YouTube. In the video after her surgery, she's sleeping and her mom is sitting vigil by her side. They are quietly talking and her mom let out a little giggle, which I didn't find that odd. Her daughter was in the clear at this point, and days of worry were finally over. She was finally relaxing. Then he leans over and said, "We shouldn't laugh. That's not an appropriate reaction to this situation." The way he said it gave me chills. I'd always suspected his emotions were fake, but this sealed it for me. I quit way before this happened because my mom was dying, and even though she was toxic and we were not close, she was still my mom and she was dying. At work that morning, he cracked a joke about it to the effect that it'd be nice if she'd hurry up and die. He thought I'd find it funny because I didn't particularly like my mom. No, dude. That was Friday, she died Sunday, and I put in my notice on Monday. Creepy FER. My coworkers and I used to joke about all the bodies he probably had buried on his farm, but we were only half joking. This is my experience with the only one I have known in high school. She was a very superficial person, and I don't mean she liked makeup and fancy things. I mean every interaction was very surface level. After knowing someone for years, you expect to know a little about their internal life, but not her. I heard about everything she bought, the drugs she'd done, remember, high school, boys, and what they'd done, never what she felt about it. Every conversation felt like she was listing her credentials. Standing off to the side, you could see her put on a face appropriate to the situation. Hanging out with her was exhausting because you could never just hang out and talk. I think she knew that those interactions were the ones where people could clock her, because she would sometimes be flippant or glib about things that would make people side-eye her. So every time we hung out, we had to be doing something, or more often doing several things. Smoking pot, drinking, watching a movie, listening to music, playing a board game, dancing, eating, all at once. And then she murdered someone. Just kidding. She's not a criminal, has never been in trouble with the law at all. She leads a very normal life. She's child-free, she has a husband, a job. She's very functional, if a little manipulative. Her friend group has grown smaller. She is possessive of her twin sister and her husband. Her identical twin sister is not like her. She's a very compassionate and kind person. She's told Look Me that her sister did kill a pet when they were young, playing with it like a doll, and did not show any guilt or remorse. Just rage when it was taken away. They didn't get her any treatment, just didn't get any more pets, and there was never another incident. They are close in a superficial way. They go out to eat once a week. They comment on each other's Facebook. But normal twin has told me mostly she feels like she has to take care of her twin to make sure she doesn't do anything bad or get into trouble. So yeah, they're not all spooky monsters. Some are just stealth, going about their life not feeling feelings. There is so much misinformation in this thread. Lots of people who have clearly spent too much time watching Criminal Minds and reading Wikipedia pages. You technically can't even diagnose psychopathy, at least clinically. The PCLR, which people have mentioned, the cherry-picked is a list of the traits commonly seen in psychopaths, and is not conclusive as many people can display these traits and not be a psychopath as such. The very model of the traits of psychopathy is reductionist and tends to ignore the context under which the behavior takes place in favor of a quick diagnosis as people scramble to see the motive in an offender's actions. After the fact, most people that fit the traditional behavioral role of a psychopath aren't violent offenders, but rather highly successful individuals who lean toward careers that reward their lack of empathy. It is even harder to recognize in children, and the idea of the psychopathic triad, killing animals, obsession with fire, and long-term bedwetting, which has long been seen to be a predictor if future violent behavior was first posited in 1964, and has been the subject of heavy debate ever since. For some context, whenever you write any kind of paper in any psychology class, research is considered out of date after 5 years, not 55. I don't claim to be a psychologist for karma. I have studied it, but not in any amount that makes me qualified to treat people. But it needed to be said that people are shamelessly milking the classic idea of a psychopath for internet points. Openly and shamelessly narcissistic behavior, then following it with a lack of remorse or admission of guilt, and topping it off with a big old load of shallow affect, which would make most of the people commenting on this thread, as judged by themselves, psychopaths. Funny that. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I agree with you about how much misinformation there is on this thread. Psychopathy is not a formal diagnosis, and at least in the UK where I practice, it is not used clinically. There has also been a lot of discussion around personality disorders in this thread, which some might suggest is related to psychopathy. However, many practicing psychologists contest the validity or usefulness of these diagnoses too. The idea that someone's personality is disordered suggests that something is inherently wrong with the person. Of course, this adds to the shame and stigma experienced by many that receives this diagnosis, I'm aware. Like with any diagnosis, some people may find comfort and solace in having a name for understanding and describing their experiences, and I would never seek to take this away from them. However, personality disorder diagnoses are potentially not valid. Multiple doctors may not agree, provide the same diagnosis when given the same information. And there has been a recent movement to think more about the experiences of those with personality difficulties in the context of trauma, for example, complex PTSD. This also goes for better understanding people who access forensic services after they have committed a crime. Context and consideration of an individual's experiences is really important. I think that threads such as this one potentially promote misunderstanding of an extremely complex set of emotions and behaviors, which in turn contributes to stigmatizing narratives for those with severe mental health difficulties or those with a personality disorder diagnosis. This thread is interesting, so I thought I'd contribute. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a criminologist. Obviously, it's not the same sort of thing, and I've never been in a clinical situation, but you might be interested in some related experiences. Note here that I'm going to be very careful with my language in order to maintain professional integrity. Apologies for the stilted language. I've been to a couple of prisons for academic stuff and work. These are not actually all that interesting, because I knew what the people in there were for, and it wasn't as if I was surprised that some of them were psychopathic. But those would be my first experiences. But my area of professional and academic expertise is child sexual victimization. I've very occasionally seen psychopaths in the making, as it were, victims who have been so terribly victimized and neglected that you can see them setting out on the path of an abuser or other type of criminal. It wasn't my responsibility to intervene, and I don't have any expertise in that area of things, but knowing the case histories, it was sad to watch. I've talked to a few police officers, social workers, and so forth about a few of them. It's like watching a large tree toppling in slow motion. You know it's going to crash into the ground. But there's not much you can do about it. I've met in a professional capacity, but in a roundabout sort of way, as it's not the usual stuff I do, the relative of a serial killer who was also once a suspect. I came away from that meeting knowing with certainty that they were the guiding hand behind the crimes of the serial killer. The police were pretty sure as well, but there was simply no evidence. Both are now deceased, and frankly, I'm not going to shed any tears for them. There was definitely familial abuse there as well. I have encountered some persons, a very small number, that were psychopathic and quite smart. This was through working within my field. One of these persons indicated that they were abusive towards animals in lieu of, or to work up to, children. I'm not going to repeat it, but what they said was something that haunts me to this day, and I haven't even been able to repeat to my closest friends or even my psychologist. Another one of these persons escaped justice, a very, very smart person. It was no one's fault, the investigation was excellent, the police were great, everything lined up, and a lot of justice was achieved. That person, however, escaped justice by being very, very smart. They were responsible for very serious, sustained offending, and would definitely be classed as a psychopath. Last, I met a friend of a person who used to be within my social circle who was also victimized in their childhood. I have a suspicion, without any solid evidence, that they have committed serious crimes. They hold down a professional job and are very successful in life. From the standpoint of someone who cannot diagnose psychopathy and was not treating or analyzing them, but has studied it, I would say that they lack any real empathy or conscience. A lot of their emotions, but not all, seem to me to be a simulated and conscious act. The abuse they suffered was of the worst possible kind. As a result, they were wary of most men, but warmed up to me a little due to the work I do. Abuse and neglect during the formative years seem to be a very common thread for many criminals and psychopaths. That said, I dare say there are some who are just wrong in the head, but I, personally, haven't encountered any of that sort. I'll end this already too long post with a word of caution to everyone reading. It's very easy to be horrified of the actions of psychopaths and criminals. It's easy to be fascinated by their psychology. But these are people, just like we are. Most of the time, their actions can be traced back to what happened to them, how they interpreted it, how they learned from their life experiences. There, but for the lottery of birth. There aren't any evil monsters living under bridges or in forests. It's just us. We bear responsibility for the evil of psychopaths as a society, as communities and nations. We create the conditions for crime and evil. We are the monsters, and we create the monsters. As Oscar Wilde put it, we are each our own devil, and we make this world our hell. The best way to know for sure is to sit down with a psychologist and tell them without reservation about your life and the way you experience the world. If you're more interested in self-diagnosis, although I would advise against it as it's entirely meaningless due to self-deception and bias, there are plenty of resources available online. You could easily find a copy of the DSM-V with 5 minutes or less of online searching. If you're looking for personal experiences which align with yours, just read through Reddit. There are plenty of us floating around. Some things you could look for pretty easily too. Do you feel empathy? Have you ever felt bad for hurting someone? Do you get sad when people leave your life? Do you miss people when they leave? Are your emotions particularly strong or long-lived? Have you ever felt love? Are you generally law-abiding due to moral reasons? Do you get outraged at moral offenses? Are you prone to loneliness? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then I would say it's unlikely that you're a sociopath. But then, I'm only able to speak from my own experience, and I'm not a psychologist, so take it with a grain of salt. I'm not sure if he was a confirmed psychopath. I didn't interact with him long consistently enough to find out for sure. I was introduced to G at a party. He was dating a friend of mine who I went to uni with, who we'll call M. I hadn't seen her for a while. We're both good friends with another friend. A was hosting a party, and M and G were there. I was introduced to G, and as soon as I went to shake his hand and met his eye contact, I knew something wasn't right. I felt the hair on the nape of my neck stand up and a shiver run down my spine. It was like there was nothing behind his eyes. I heard a little voice in the back of my head telling me to run for the hills. I met him a few times after that, and each time my lizard brain was internally screaming at me, I was on edge the whole time. I heard through A over the course of the next 6 months about how G was manipulative, controlling, and vindictive towards M, and A was seeing less and less of M. A initially tried to reassure me that I was exaggerating and making it up when I confessed I didn't like him right off the bat. Slowly, she conceded that, okay, maybe G was on the spectrum or something. Eventually, she agreed that he was manipulative, but never met me at Psychopath. Either way, A and I both assisted M in leaving the relationship. She was alive and girlfriend towards the end, and she's now happily single. A freaky nightmare for her, but a happy ending. She's had some counseling, and we've closed ranks around her, and she's now happy sort of that she's been through it because she feels she's less naive about the world. Not a psychologist, but 4 days ago after 35 years, I found out by myself that my father is either a psychopath or a hardcore narcissist, without him taking any guilt at all for anything or any feeling of remorse for what he is doing, having blamed and shamed me all my life when we were both alone, so there were never witnesses. You are the best son I can think of in public, and I'm so disappointed in you. And way more in private. Push and pull. You can't do anything right and think you're to blame. There was not much physical abuse because it seems they don't like to leave traces on your body. I did a ton of personal development work on my own for 4 years and left my home country 3 years ago because I thought something was wrong with me. I was lying in bed and cried out of fear of having to go into a mental asylum many times. 3 years of separation and hundreds or even thousands of hours of contemplation and building up knowledge about personal development. And many insights lead me to freedom, only to realize that because of this history of my father, I was in a relationship with a narcissist. Because I now was very sensitive, I could feel when I got manipulated by her, I cut cords immediately. You are a honeypot for these types of personality disorders because you are already weak and an easy prey. So chances are high that it's not only one person in your circle of friends, and you can literally trust no one who he has had any contact with at all. It is enough when people have had a nice first impression of him that they doubt everything you say, and by that increase the feeling that you already have that you are going insane. Because of this, if you have only the slightest suspicion, I'd suggest seeing a counselor, because he is a neutral person, and tell him about your suspicion. A clear sign after the break-in period where Heshe gains your trust is that you feel confused, or like in my case, you think that something is wrong with your mind or that you go insane if it goes long enough. Only after hardcore analyzing yourself and listening carefully how your body and mind reacts to the words spoken by that N or P, you have a slight chance to identify him, her. Also, another sign I think is overlooked too often is that when you have very low self-esteem, are insecure, constant self-doubting, etc., chances are high that you are under the influence of at least one abuser. Their biggest tool is that you trust every word of them, which makes it almost impossible to see what really is happening. Also, it, in my case, always happens off record. So you never have proof that they manipulate you. They are ultra nice to your friends, so when you start talking to them, they are on the side of the abuser, which can really drive you crazy with self-doubt. It must be like that to be physically abused, and everyone says you are responsible for having been abused. Victim shaming. And a last tip, if you realize it, don't confront them and don't try to rescue people of his circle. You might have already the label crazy on you. He managed that. They have to loose their identity, which is for them the same as to die. So they might even kill to prevent this from coming out. Cut cords and never exchange any more words with them or their friends is my solution. And check your friends for signs of this behavior. It really is that creepy, or even more. I'm a psychologist, but not a therapist. However, this weekend, I got called out to my sister's home because her husband was threatening suicide. I got there freaking out thinking that I was going to find a body, to him just sitting there sipping whiskey. He thought it was funny. I literally had my video camera out and had already Googled the sheriff's number in case I found him dead. We went inside after I chewed him the F out, and he tried to tell me that he never said anything about hurting himself. He convinced me that my sister was overreacting and being dramatic. Well, my sister came home a few minutes later. I made it there before her, and she started reading the texts. Tell the kids I love them. Tell them to say their prayers, their yes ma'ams and no ma'ams. Tell them not to feel sad. I want you to be happy. I don't want you to feel guilty about this. This wasn't your fault. This has always been my destiny. I'm trying to think of more, but it was basically a straight 20 minutes of this shht, and then he turned off his phone. So he basically wrote a suicide note in order to get a response from my sister and just F-ing lied directly to my face about it. Then, when he got confronted in front of me, he sat there talking about how he was in trouble. He lambasted my sister for calling his parents. I suggested counseling. He went off about how no mortal man can tell him about himself. So, tell doctor, yesterday I realized my brother-in-law is a complete psycho, no empathy, no remorse, focused solely on himself, willing to put other people through hell just to get his way. I knew he had issues, but this is beyond anything I suspected. And he just still can't wrap his head around how awful it was. For anyone concerned, his own mother and father got involved and they're making him stay with them until he gets some counseling. We'll see how that works out. Not really hopeful. Not a psychologist. But I know a person who is diagnosed high on spectrum. Crazy interesting dude that you never fully trust. Met him through parties at university. He was the party guy. Always hosted the best ones, knew tons of people, your typical idolized party kid that everyone had wanted to be friends with. I always thought he was a liar and never really gave him a ton of my time or energy. But friends liked his party, so we went. Went for a smoke one day and he followed me down to talk and was trying to pull all his usual stuff. The microfacial expressions explains a lot why I didn't believe him in almost everything. He slept with a lot of girls, like a lot. I never thought he seemed the type to just be a horny player, couldn't ever put my finger on why. So he followed me down and started going off just talking, and I just kind of ignored him and pulled the who thing. I had no interest in being lied to. Finally, he got fed up and started trying to turn the tables on me, saying I was stuck up, we could be great friends ECT. I had enough and said basically, no, because you're a blatant liar and use people, and I've seen this going on for over a year, not interested. Then the oddest part happened, his face just went blank. And I don't mean blank like someone's who in shock or anything, like scary watching a horror movie blank. I, being the dummy I am, just stood there annoyed, making eye contact, it felt like forever. Finally he goes, how do you all this? I basically told him I could just tell, had a gut feeling. He uses people, he uses all the girls he sleeps with, and he uses the parties as attention, not anything else. That's when, for the first time in the whole time I had ever seen him, he told the truth. Once again, I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. He has ASPD and was partially diagnosed when he was younger and confirmed when he got a bit older. I was right for his reasons why he did the stuff he did. Whole time he had this blank face with just the odd twitch on it. Then boom, he starts laughing and joking around again, trying to get a reaction from me. We had a few interactions like this over the years, and I still bump into him on odd occasions. He has always turned it into a game of when he takes girls home or obviously manipulates people apparently not obvious to them, of catching my eye and shooting me a wink. Like, we're in some private joke together. I'm a bit late to this, so not sure this will be seen, but my wife is bugging me to share. I actually started my career in forensic psychology, but decided to get out of it after I got stabbed and assaulted a few times by patients. I then started working with children and teens. It was there, working with an 8-year-old girl, we'll call her Sarah, that I came across my first person I'd earmark as a psychopath. Sarah came from a pretty good family, and they were really dedicated to help her moving forward. The parents had no obvious concerns with their own behavior, and they seemed to be pretty well-regulated folks. They had bounced across a few therapists before seeing me, most of which seemed to struggle with the fact that Sarah did not seem to be demonstrating more traditional behavioral issues. For example, she was not impulsive. She did not just lose her temper and go wild. Instead, Sarah was attentive, planning, and meticulous. She was pretty textbook in that she had a long history of mutilated Barbies and some quite hurt animals along her path. The part that was a bit unique with Sarah is she rarely got in trouble for doing anything, because it seemed that she was really good at convincing other children, usually those a bit younger than he, of doing things. We got my foot in the door by doing some psych testing with Sarah. I had a booklet in front of her. Thing costs about $200 that we use for the tests. Sarah proceeded to slowly rip one page at a time while looking me in the eye. I have a pretty good poker face. She asked me what I was going to do about it. I said nothing. She continued. After a while, she admitted that she was surprised I had not reacted yet. I told her it wasn't my booklet and that I just work here. That actually was why she stopped. The next 9 hours I spent with Sarah continued with this kind of stuff. The most uncomfortable part was that she just stared at me constantly and tried to read my face. I think she was really thrown off by my lack of expression. When she was observed with her parents, she did the exact same thing. Child Protective Services was already well involved, and everyone was kind of unsure what to do about this kid. She was, fortunately or unfortunately, about to move across the country and into a heavily wooded area. I remember her dad somewhat sadly joking, "At least the animals there might fight back." I remember the parents just seemed scared. About 6 months after she moved, one of the worst fires in the history of the area happened and destroyed entire towns. I've always wondered if it was Sarah. To start, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything. I'm a welder, LOL. But this thread brought to mind someone that I worked with for a while a few years ago. I am a pretty confident man, am not really intimidated by most people, but this guy, he frightened me. I was working for a small company, and I was the foreman. We were looking to hire someone to replace my old job of building hydraulic parts. He was my first pick to hire out of the people we interviewed. Looking back now, I see that I was duped. He was friendly, but just way overly friendly. I remember even thinking at the time that it was almost unsettling how friendly he was. We hired him, and that changed within the first month. He didn't really seem to be interested in anyone other than himself. He had 3 children, and he treated his family like they were garbage. He bragged to me about throwing one of his son's toys down the stairs and destroying it because there were scratches on the side of it. He had a severely autistic son that they used to lock into his bedroom at night and still wore diapers at the age of 12. He refused to have him put in a care facility, even though that was seriously what needed to be done for him, at least for a while. He was very strange when it came to his daughter. He was overly attached, and I personally felt, and still feel, that he was or is molesting her. He told me that he bought her better clothes because girls are on a different level. He was the only one allowed to brush her hair because my wife can't do it right, and neither can my daughter. He was an absolute terror to his wife. There was hardly a day that he wasn't screaming at her, even when she did something nice like brought him food. He married her when she was 16, and she isn't allowed to see her family. He even had a charge of kidnapping when he and another underage girl tried to run off together. They made it a few states away when he was caught. He was pissed the court won't expunge his record. If you told him anything bad was happening to you, he automatically came back with something that related to him. A friend of mine had committed suicide, and when I told him, he looked at me without any feeling whatsoever, not even the obligatory, "Sorry about your loss, man." He would get extremely angry if you did him wrong in any way. He was also extremely manipulative and sneaky. I tried to get him a promotion before all of this showed up at the main warehouse in another state. He flew there, and I found out later when he was there, he was trying to talk them into firing me. Luckily, he blew up when they said they would not meet his demands, and they let me know what he was up to. He frightened me enough that I let my wife and mom know that if I turned up missing, that he should be considered the main suspect. IDK. If he was a true psychopath or just an extremely angry narcissist, all I know is I've never met anyone like him before or since. Not a psychologist, but knew someone who was diagnosed as a psychopath in school. We'd started on the same day, so we'd sort of gotten lumped together. People tended to avoid him because he was frankly a little odd. He didn't do anything particularly, but looking back, that was it. He didn't do anything. He didn't seem to enjoy anything. He just sort of followed everybody around. Anyway, years go by, and he and his family move to the States. A few weeks later, my mom calls his mom and finds out some things. The guy, we'll call him E, had a rage fit and launched chairs, tables, and who knows what else through windows, doors, anything in reach. It had apparently taken 3 police officers to pin him down. During this time, he'd also apparently stripped naked. After a short interview, he was committed to a hospital where he was diagnosed as a psychopath. Sometime later, he came back here. Me and my mom ended up staying friends with the family since I also knew E's siblings really well, and I went to their house. I decided before going I wasn't going to treat him differently, as I believe even people like that deserve some form of normalcy even if they don't understand it. Maybe it was because now I knew, but I realized just how off he was. I'm not sure what it was exactly, but he could talk about some pretty messed up stuff completely straight-faced. I specifically remember him saying he wanted to join ISIS so he could shoot people. He wasn't particularly intelligent, so I never got the Hannibal Lecter vibe, but I definitely understand what people mean by a primal sort of fear. It's the feeling of your body priming itself to bolt at the first sign of trouble, muscles tensing, subconsciously judging how quickly you can get to the door, etc. I remember one time, after a particular enlightening conversation with E about how the Jews were secretly aliens, I stepped outside for a breather and spoke to his mom in the kitchen. I knew her pretty well since I was in my mid-teens by this point, so I asked her straight, "Mrs. E, please don't take this the wrong way, but if E has one of his moments when I'm around, what do I do?" She sighed, looked at me and said, "Whatever you have to do." She'd apparently been told by the psychology team there was a very high likelihood E would try to kill one of the family someday, and she'd explain to the others. There was no shame in defending themselves. I haven't seen or spoken to the family in quite a few years for one reason or another. but I sometimes wonder how they are. It might seem overdramatic, but that day I did steel myself that I might end up killing one of my oldest friends to stop him killing me or one of his siblings. I rationalized it that in that moment, he wouldn't be E anymore, just a threat. Not a psychologist, but worked in a residential treatment facility for teen boys for a while during college. My biggest takeaway was that most criminals aren't fundamentally bad. They're broken in some way and make bad choices sometimes. But there was also a degree of honor among them. We lived on a huge campus, and the cabins of patients didn't interact much. Because I was a young, small woman, I was obviously never going to be a physical match for my patients should they decide to attack me. It wasn't scary, though. I actually never felt safer than when we were transitioning to and from activities because I knew if one of the patients in another cabin so much as looked at me wrong, my boys were not going to put up with it. They bonded to me quickly and other staff, typically because they didn't have very many good examples of adults in their own lives. That said, there was one kid I will never forget as long as I live. This kid, let's call him D, scared the shit out of me. D had been inpatient for over 4 years. The average stay is 6 months. He had recently stepped down from the secured cabin to our cabin, and his reputation preceded him. At first, I was naive and figured he was just misunderstood the last time I ever got white savior complex. It eventually became clear that DS problems were deeper than I was remotely equipped to deal with. Apparently, this had been the case over the 4 years he'd be there. He couldn't be in a foster group home because he'd raped the other children, typically younger boys, but if he were mad enough, he'd do it to anyone he could pin down. He was essentially unadoptable, and didn't want to be adopted anyway because he thought his mom would be hurt. She wasn't. She was just as scared of him as everyone else. I finally realized how bad it was when I realized he'd punish himself if in so doing he also got the satisfaction of hurting someone else. For example, he'd constantly talk shit to the biggest guy on our cabin. The guy would ignore it until eventually D wore him down enough or said the right thing, and then the big guy would kick DS ass. And D got hurt. But the other kid would get locked down for putting hands on someone. It delayed his release. D got off on that. He didn't care about physical pain if it meant someone else was made to suffer. One night, everything was winding down, and it was almost time for bed. D wasn't listening or participating or something. I don't even remember the exact event, only that something happened, and next thing I know, D is coming at me, and he's not holding back. Or he wants to kill me. Another therapist, a large, wonderful patient man, pulled him back and put him into what we call a hold. It doesn't hurt, but it does pin you down. I used that time to go into the office and call for backup. There were no windows in the office, but I could hear D outside the door screaming for me to come out so he could grape me with a stapler like I deserved, and other very specific threats. But even still, I thought maybe he could be rehabilitated. Then, the next day, the large man who had protected me wasn't at work. I asked about him. He was on probation because D claimed he hurt his arm while restraining him. There were cameras everywhere and we watched the video, but when it's a fight with several people gather around like that, it can be hard to tell details. Eventually, the therapist resigned because getting fired for abuse is a quick way to end your career. It wasn't until that day that I realized the whole thing was calculated. D acted out enough that our cabin wasn't able to go to the dining hall and had to have sack lunches for dinner. He knew this would create aggravation. Then he used the already tumultuous atmosphere to act out and get the other boys more riled. He knew if he came for me, someone would step in. He knew that it would probably not follow exact standards for a hold, or at the very least, the video would be inconclusive. He knew the therapist would quit or be fired. There was no point. The male therapist wasn't overly hard on D, he just happened to be the one on duty when D decided to ruin someone's life. It was that event that made me realize that some people aren't worth saving. I ended up moving states, taking an office job, and never returning to the city I worked in. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to see more.